Nietzsche's masterpiece of moral philosophy, a deep dive into On the Genealogy of Morals. The key to subverting morality. Nietzsche's probing questions. Where does morality come from? Why has the definition of good and evil remained unresolved for millennia? On the Genealogy of Morals is Nietzsche's incisive philosophical masterpiece that unveils the truth behind the origins of morality, challenging our understanding of humanity and values. Let us step into the intellectual turbulence of the 19th century to explore how Nietzsche uses genealogy to deconstruct the power games of morality and reshape our conception of good. The origin of morality is not a divine revelation, but a product of the interplay between human history and power. Using the genealogical method, Nietzsche views morality as a dynamic process of evolution, tracing how it transformed from the power dynamics of primitive societies into the spiritual shackles of modern society. He not only questions the absoluteness of morality, but also reveals the psychological and social mechanisms hidden behind good and evil. This book is not merely a philosophical text, but an intellectual adventure, inviting us to confront our innermost beliefs and re-examine what values are worth pursuing. Nietzsche's questioning strikes like thunder, shattering our habitual understanding of morality and forcing us to consider, are we unconsciously bound by the moral legacy of history? In 19th century Europe, the rationalism of the Enlightenment clashed fiercely with the traditional morality of Christianity. This collision was not confined to the realm of ideas, but profoundly influenced social structures and individual lives. The Enlightenment, represented by thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau, advocated replacing religious dogma with science and freedom, seeking a new foundation for morality. However, the millennia-long influence of Christianity did not waver easily, its moral norms deeply embedded through churches, schools, and families. For example, the 18th century French philosopher Voltaire critiqued the hypocrisy of the church in his philosophical dictionary, yet acknowledged the complexity of morality, noting it often served social control rather than individual liberation. Nietzsche keenly perceived this contradiction, arguing that while Enlightenment rationalism challenged religious authority, it failed to escape the shadow of slave morality. For instance, Kant's categorical imperative sought to reshape morality through universal reason, but its emphasis on duty and restraint perpetuated the ascetic logic of Christianity. Nietzsche's genealogy is thus not only a critique of religion, but also a reflection on rationalism. He prompts us to consider, does modern society's moral framework still unconsciously inherit historical conditioning? This insight makes On the Genealogy of Morals a work that transcends its time, challenging us to examine the roots and impacts of morality. The Industrial Revolution brought material prosperity, but exposed social inequalities and spiritual emptiness. Nietzsche, living in this era, rebelled against tradition while prophesying the future. He wrote in the book, "We must become our own experimenters." This statement is not only a call to his readers, but a challenge to each of us. In the fog of morality, do you dare to seek your own answers? Nietzsche's rebellion, from prodigy to philosophical warrior. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in the Prussian town of Reken, where his father, a devout Lutheran pastor, raised him in an atmosphere steeped in religion and discipline. He lost his father at age 5 and was raised by his mother and sister, growing up immersed in theology and classical literature, displaying remarkable talent. At 14, Nietzsche entered the prestigious Fortis School, mastering Greek and Latin, devouring Homer, Shakespeare, and Goethe, and producing polished prose and precocious poetry. In 1864, he enrolled at the University of Bonn, initially studying theology, but his encounter with Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation shifted his focus to philosophy, leading him to question the absoluteness of Christian morality. In his autobiography Ex Homo, he wrote, "I must become a wrestler, battling against old values." This rebellious spirit stemmed from his disdain for dogma, propelling him from a prodigy to a philosophical warrior challenging his era. At 24, Nietzsche became the youngest professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, astonishing the academic world. Yet, he grew weary of the rigidity of academia and resigned in 1879 due to deteriorating health, embarking on a decade of nomadic writing. Plagued by migraines, failing eyesight, and digestive issues, his suffering fueled profound reflections on life and pain. On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, is the pinnacle of his mature thought, encapsulating his insights into the origins of morality. Nietzsche's genealogical method departs from traditional philosophical deduction, tracing the historical roots of morality and revealing how good and evil evolved from power struggles into spiritual shackles. Nietzsche's era, the intellectually vibrant 19th century, saw the Industrial Revolution reshape society, Darwin's theory of evolution challenge religious authority, and Enlightenment rationalism clash with traditional faith. This intellectual ferment provided fertile ground for Nietzsche's work. Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, appended creationism, shaking Christianity's cosmic order. Meanwhile, Marx's theory of class struggle exposed the roots of social injustice, igniting workers' movements. Nietzsche witnessed these upheavals, sensing the fragility of traditional morality under the assault of science and social movements. For example, the German philosopher Feuerbach, in The Essence of Christianity, argued that religion was a product of human self-alienation, inspiring Nietzsche's critical reflections on morality. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he wrote, "God is dead, and we have killed him." This was not merely a statement about religion, but a diagnosis of the spiritual crisis of the era. Nietzsche believed that the collapse of morality posed the threat of nihilism, requiring humanity to rebuild values amidst the ruins of meaning. This insight makes On the Genealogy of Morals a profound response to the intellectual crisis of the 19th century. His philosophy is both a challenge to traditional dogma and an exploration of how humanity can navigate the uncertainties of the future. For instance, his falling out with Wagner was not just personal, but reflected his disappointment in the fusion of art and religion, underscoring his commitment to life's vitality. He witnessed the rise of science and the crisis of morality, sensing humanity's spiritual disorientation amid material progress. His philosophy is not merely an expression of personal rebellion, but a response to the dilemmas of his time. For example, his break with Wagner stemmed from the latter's later works embracing religious themes, betraying the vitality Nietzsche cherished. This interplay of personal experience and historical context makes On the Genealogy of Morals a powerful work confronting humanity and history. His thought is a sharp blade, slicing through the facade of morality to reveal its deeper mechanisms of power and psychology. Nietzsche's rebellion is not mere destruction, but a call to unleash human potential. In his writing, he pushed his physical limits, seeking meaning in suffering. His philosophy is not only a deconstruction of morality, but a celebration of creativity. He prompts us to ask, in a world bound by tradition, how do we find our own path? Masters and Slaves, The Power Origins of Morality. The first essay of On the Genealogy of Morals begins with the opposition between master morality and slave morality, revealing the power roots of morality. Nietzsche argues that in ancient societies, good was defined by the strong. Nobles and warriors, through their strength, courage, and vitality, labeled their actions as good, while the weak and lowly were deemed evil. He writes, Good is known. Ill is base. This is the original vocabulary of master morality. This morality centered on affirming life, celebrating pride, freedom, and creativity. In ancient Greece, for example, the hero Achilles in Homer's Iliad embodies master morality. He pursued glory, despised cowardice, and saw battle as the meaning of life. In the Iliad, Achilles withdraws from battle when his honor is insulted, demonstrating master morality's obsession with self-worth. However, with societal changes, particularly the rise of Christianity, the weak reshaped morality through resentment. Nietzsche argues that priests and the oppressed redefined humility, pity, and patience as good, condemning the pride and dominance of the strong as evil. This slave morality came at the cost of negating life, promoting self-restraint and compassion for others. In the 1st century Roman Empire, Christians, as a marginalized group, preached, "Love your enemies," and "Blessed are the meek." Nietzsche sees this as the weak's spiritual revenge against the strong. He writes, "Resentment created morality, turning the weakness of the powerless into a virtue." For example, St. Paul spread Christian slave morality through his preaching, subverting the values of Roman nobility. In 313 CE, Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan legalized Christianity, and humility and pity gradually became dominant values. This reversal was achieved through institutionalized dissemination and cultural reshaping. Christianity's teachings, for instance, spread widely through the Church's organizational power and the authority of its texts. In the 4th century, Christian theologians like Augustine systematized slave morality into a theological framework through works like The City of God, endowing humility and pity with divine sanctity. This systematization not only transformed individual beliefs, but reshaped societal norms. For example, Roman law gradually incorporated Christian ethics, banning brutal gladiatorial contests and curbing the violent rights of slave owners. These changes, while seemingly advancing humanitarian concerns, were in reality a redistribution of power. Nietzsche argues that the triumph of slave morality was not moral progress, but the weak seizing spiritual hegemony through discourse. He further notes that this moral reversal is also evident in philosophical traditions. For instance, Plato's Republic, though predating Christianity, shows early traces of slave morality, with its emphasis on justice requiring individuals to subordinate their desires to the collective good of the state. This philosophical tradition laid the groundwork for Christian morality. Nietzsche's insight reveals that moral changes are always intertwined with power redistribution. He prompts us to ask, do today's moral norms also conceal power dynamics? For example, in the colonial expansions of the late 19th century, Western powers imposed their moral standards on colonies under the guise of civilizing them, masking imperialistic hegemony behind the definition of good. The triumph of slave morality was not merely religious dissemination, but a reconfiguration of power structures. Nietzsche's insight forces us to reflect, are today's morals still constrained by ancient power struggles? For instance, in the 19th century British workers' movement, workers labeled the wealth and power of capitalists as evil, promoting equality and mutual aid, echoing the logic of slave morality. Nietzsche's analysis not only uncovers the origins of morality, but challenges us to examine whether we accept certain definitions of good out of fear or powerlessness. This insight prompts us to rethink the essence of morality and how it subtly shapes our thoughts and actions. Debt and guilt, the disciplinary mechanism of morality. The second essay explores the origins of evil and sin, focusing on how humans transition from instinctual animality to morally disciplined subjects. Nietzsche proposes that morality began with the concepts of debt and punishment. In primitive societies, debt was not only an economic relationship, but the foundation of social contracts. Those who failed to repay debts faced bodily or freedom-based penalties, forming the logic of punishment. This logic gradually internalized into conscience, leading humans to self-punish. For example, the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi 18th century BC stipulated that if a debtor could not repay, creditors could enslave their children or take body parts as payment. This punishment not only maintained economic order, but ingrained a sense of debt in people's minds. Nietzsche writes, "The sting of conscience is humanity's betrayal of its animal instincts." He argues that through self-punishment, humans suppress their instinctual freedom in favor of moral obedience. The experience of 19th century British writer Charles Dickens serves as an example. At age 12, Dickens was sent to work in a factory due to his father's debts, suffering humiliation and self-blame. In David Copperfield, he depicts similar pressures of debt, reflecting how guilt became a tool of social discipline. Nietzsche further notes that Christianity linked sin to a debt to God, teaching believers to bear original sin, redeemable only through repentance and obedience. In the 4th century, Saint Augustine wrote in his Confessions, "My sins weigh like a burden, crushing my breath." This internalized guilt became a mechanism for moral control. This internalization of guilt was not just a psychological phenomenon, but a tool of social control. Nietzsche argues that moral discipline permeated through education, religious rituals, and social norms. For example, the medieval confession system required believers to regularly confess sins to priests, exposing personal privacy to the church's oversight, further reinforcing guilt. The 12th century theologian Peter Abelard, punished by the church for his romance with H. Lewes, expressed profound self-blame for his sins in the history of my calamities, demonstrating the church's power to control thought through guilt. Nietzsche notes that this control extended beyond religion into secular society. For instance, 18th century Puritan society in America emphasized diligence and restraint, viewing laziness as a moral sin. This ethos, enforced through community moral oversight, compelled individuals to self-regulate, even suppressing natural creative impulses. Nietzsche's analysis reveals that guilt is not only a psychological state, but a tool for maintaining social order. He prompts us to reflect: does modern society still discipline individuals through similar mechanisms? For example, workplace cultures that glorify overtime and dedication, do they impose a form of moral discipline, making people feel guilty for not meeting standards? Nietzsche's insight reminds us that behind guilt often lies the operation of power, shaping our behavior and thoughts through moral norms. Nietzsche further explores the psychological mechanism of punishment, noting that the pleasure of punishment stems from the power to inflict pain. For example, public executions in ancient Rome were not just legal enforcement, but rituals of rulers displaying power. Nietzsche argues that this pleasure in power internalized into self-punishment, forming the deep structure of modern morality. He asks us to consider: are we still punishing ourselves for fabricated debts? This insight not only traces the history of sin, but challenges us to examine the moral shackles within us. Nietzsche also points out that the reinforcement of guilt is closely tied to the ascetic ideal. Ascetics pursue spiritual purity through self-denial. For instance, 13th century Dominican monks whipped themselves to atone, a practice Nietzsche sees as redirecting vitality towards self-destruction. He critiques: the ascetic ideal is a betrayal of humanity. This logic of self-punishment not only shaped individual psychology, but influenced societal value systems. For example, the medieval Inquisition reinforced guilt's cultural hegemony by punishing heretics, further solidifying Christianity's moral control. The power of the priest, the manipulation of the ascetic ideal. The third essay focuses on the ascetic ideal, analyzing how priests reshaped morality through spiritual manipulation. Nietzsche argues that the ascetic ideal is the pinnacle of slave morality, driven by the priestly class, which pushed life-denying values to the extreme. Priests, not merely religious leaders, but intellectual wielders of discourse, gave meaning to the suffering of the weak through asceticism, humility, and promises of afterlife salvation, while suppressing the vitality of the strong. For example, Saint Augustine in the Middle Ages described his transformation from a life of indulgence to Christian conversion in Confessions, promoting asceticism and repentance as the path to God. Nietzsche sees this doctrine not as pure faith, but as the priest's pursuit of power. He writes, "The ascetic ideal is the priest's way of giving meaning to suffering, making the weak willingly endure it. By framing suffering as a path to salvation, priests controlled the spiritual world of believers." For instance, Augustine's teachings on original sin and self-restraint profoundly shaped medieval morality, structuring Western society's spiritual framework. Nietzsche further analyzes that the ascetic ideal extended beyond religion into philosophy and art. For example, Schopenhauer's pessimistic philosophy advocated denying desires, viewing art as an escape from suffering. Nietzsche critiques this as weakening life's creativity. He cites Wagner's operas, noting that early works like The Ring of the Nibelung brimmed with vitality, while later ones, influenced by religion, succumbed to ascetic heaviness. Wagner's shift reflects the ascetic ideal's erosion of artistic spirit, a loss Nietzsche deeply regretted. The manipulation of the ascetic ideal is not confined to history. In modern society, notions overly emphasizing self-restraint, like the denial of material desires, still influence lifestyles. For example, the late 19th century temperance movement in America branded alcohol as the root of evil, attempting to control social behavior through moral discipline. Nietzsche's analysis warns us to beware of spiritual shackles cloaked in nobility. He prompts us to ask, does the ascetic ideal still shape our thoughts in new forms? For instance, does the modern pursuit of a perfect life represent a veiled form of asceticism, requiring us to suppress true emotions and desires? Nietzsche does not entirely reject the value of asceticism. He acknowledges that asceticism can cultivate willpower, as seen in artists creating masterpieces through discipline. For example, Mozart persisted in composing the magic flute despite poverty and illness, showcasing the positive side of asceticism. However, Nietzsche warns that when asceticism suppresses humanity rather than enhancing creativity, it becomes a tool of enslavement. The essence of this enslavement lies in the ascetic ideal, masking its suppression of vitality by giving meaning to suffering. For instance, Saint Francis of Assisi in the 13th century abandoned his noble life for extreme poverty and asceticism, founding the Franciscan order. His actions were deemed holy, but Nietzsche sees them as a denial of life's instincts. Francis's ascetic lifestyle attracted countless followers, but led people to view suffering as a necessary path to God, weakening impulses for creation and joy. Nietzsche further notes that the ascetic ideal's influence extends beyond religion into secular culture. For example, the 17th century Puritan movement in England emphasized restraint and discipline, viewing pleasure as the root of sin. This culture, through family education and social norms, shaped a morality that suppressed individuality. Nietzsche argues that the true danger of the ascetic ideal is that it habituates people to self-denial, abandoning their love for life. He prompts us to ask, does modern society still perpetuate this ascetic logic? For instance, do certain minimalist movements, advocating the abandonment of material desires for a pure lifestyle, inadvertently suppress human creativity? Nietzsche's critique urges us to re-examine the boundaries of asceticism and its role in moral systems. The cost of morality, the suppression and liberation of life. Nietzsche argues that the triumph of slave morality and the ascetic ideal came at a profound cost: the suppression of human life. He points out that moral discipline robbed individuals of instinctual freedom, trapping them in self-denial and suffering. For example, Christianity's concept of original sin burdened believers with eternal guilt, stifling impulses for creation and joy. Nietzsche writes, "The triumph of morality comes at the cost of life's vitality." For instance, Renaissance painter Michelangelo, deeply influenced by religion, created the Last Judgment filled with fear of sin. The anguished expressions in the artwork reflect the ascetic ideal's spiritual oppression of the artist. Nietzsche believes this oppression not only limited individuals but weakened societal vitality. For example, medieval monastery culture, with its emphasis on asceticism and silence, stifled innovation in art and science until the Renaissance reignited life's creativity. However, Nietzsche does not wholly reject morality. He suggests that by re-examining the origins of morality, humanity can reclaim life's creativity. He champions the superhuman, Bermensch ideal, urging individuals to transcend traditional moral constraints and create their own values. For example, Goethe's Faust embodies Nietzsche's vision of vitality, with its protagonist pursuing knowledge and freedom. Faust, unsatisfied with traditional moral limits, boldly explores the unknown, displaying the courage to transcend discipline. Nietzsche's call for liberation is not an empty slogan, but a summons to individual awakening. For instance, 19th century women's suffrage leader Elizabeth Cady Stanton challenged traditional gender morality, advocating for women's equal rights. Her actions not only changed laws, but redefined the value of justice. Nietzsche prompts us to ask, how do we find freedom within the framework of morality? How do we create new values amidst historical constraints? This liberation is not immediate. Nietzsche warns that overcoming moral suppression requires facing the crisis of nihilism. When traditional morality collapses without new values to replace it, humanity risks falling into a void of meaning. For example, in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan questions the existence of God and morality, but suffers from the inability to find alternative meaning. Nietzsche predicts that this nihilism is a major challenge for modern society. He asks us to consider, can we rebuild life's meaning on the ruins of morality? The insight of genealogy, revaluing all values. Nietzsche's genealogy is not only a historical tracing of morality, but a methodology encouraging us to question all established values. He argues that morality is not an eternal truth, but a product of specific times and power dynamics. By deconstructing the origins of good and evil, he calls for a revaluation of all values, redefining what constitutes a life worth living. For example, 20th century philosopher Sartre, whose existentialism built on Nietzsche's ideas, emphasized individual freedom to choose life's meaning. Sartre wrote in Being and Nothingness, "Man is condemned to be free." This echoes Nietzsche's superhuman ideal, encouraging individuals to break free from traditional moral constraints and create their own values. For instance, Marie Curie defied gender and societal moral restrictions to focus on scientific research, embodying Nietzsche's champion creative spirit. Her persistence led to the discovery of radium and challenged 19th century expectations of women. Nietzsche's genealogy also inspires reflection on modern society. For example, does consumerism, which defines happiness as possession, represent a new form of moral discipline? Does the culture of social media reshape standards of good? For instance, the 1960s civil rights movement, led by Martin Luther King Jr., challenged the moral legitimacy of racial segregation, redefining justice. His actions show that moral evolution is ongoing, requiring critical scrutiny. Nietzsche's revaluation of all values does not reject morality, but calls for rethinking good with vitality as the guide. This revaluation aims to liberate individuals, freeing us from the moral shackles of history. For example, early 20th century philosopher Kierkegaard, in Fear and Trembling, explored the conflict between individual faith and moral norms, emphasizing the importance of personal choice. His ideas align with Nietzsche's superhuman concept, urging people to transcend socially imposed moral standards to find inner meaning. Nietzsche's Genealogy is not only a reflection on history, but a guide to the future. He shows that moral evolution is an open process, with each generation able to redefine the meaning of good. For example, the 20th century feminist movement challenged traditional gender roles, redefining values of equality and freedom. This revaluation is not destruction, but an affirmation of vitality. Nietzsche's philosophy inspires us, in a pluralistic modern society, to maintain critical thinking and courageously create our own value systems. He prompts us to ask, are we bold enough to challenge ingrained moral norms and give new meaning to our lives? For instance, the modern environmental movement has redefined good by framing the protection of nature as a moral responsibility. This shift reflects Nietzsche's insight that morality is dynamic, requiring updates with the times. He asks us to consider, how do we create new values for our era? This reflection concerns not only philosophy, but every individual's life choices. Epilogue, the future of morality and our choices. On the Genealogy of Morals is a mirror reflecting human nature, revealing how morality evolved from power struggles into spiritual shackles. Nietzsche's Genealogy deconstructs the origins of good and evil, challenging us to rethink the meaning of life. His philosophy is not cold critique, but a call to unleash human potential. Can we transcend historical constraints to create freer, fuller lives? Nietzsche's insights remain resonant today. Whether for individual awakening or societal value reshaping, we need the courage to question and create. For example, early 20th century artist Picasso broke traditional painting rules, creating cubism and challenging the boundaries of aesthetics and morality. His Guernica boldly condemned war, embodying Nietzsche's affirmation of vitality. As Nietzsche wrote, "You must become yourself." In the Genealogy of Morality, each of us is an explorer writing our own chapter of values. The future of morality depends on our choices. In an era of pluralistic values, how do we define good? Do we conform to tradition or dare to create? Nietzsche offers no answers, but his questions are eternal. Can we transcend history's shadows and live out life's infinite possibilities? Let us start with this book, re-examining our values and stepping toward a freer future. Are you ready to revalue your values?